Hi, we continue with the genealogy in Genesis 5, what scholar David Carr calls the book of the descendants, or the book of the Toledot, literally from the Hebrew of Adam. And I've got the screen scrolled back up to the beginning of chapter 5, even though today we're going to start with verse 6, where the numbers of the named people are expressed, because I want to go back to something we didn't look at last time, and that's this phrase here. We looked last time at how it doesn't really mean list at all. It means, the word sefer means book. But I hadn't yet encountered David Carr's fabulous detailed description of how this section might have been put together. And I want to note a couple of things that he highlights that we'll look at today and we'll also look at another time. So as you can see from my note below, he says that the word sefer generally refers to a text written on freestanding media, and hence suggests here an original book of the Toledot of Adam that continues in chapter 11, setting up the connection with Abraham, and thus making it the generations from Adam to Abraham. So I hadn't focused on that last time as the question of whether this was originally part of a separate, separate text of a Toledot of the descendants of Adam. So we're not going to look at that question because I'm not really focused on the form issues of how Genesis was put together, other than the fact that it connects us with the Babylonian exilic text that would be of relationship with these, as we've been seeing all along since Genesis 1. So let's jump back into the list here as we begin in verse 6. And the first thing that most ordinary readers note here is, what's with these long ages? And naively, people want to try to interpret it so it makes it somehow realistic. But these numbers are not quote-unquote realistic. In fact, we can say as a principle that, as far as I can tell, is without exception, all biblical numbers are symbolic, which is to say they're not used as counting devices. They're used to express something, as words are, to tell us something about the situations or relationships between people and God, or between one people and other peoples, as we'll see today. The challenge for scholars always is, how does the symbolism work? What exactly are they symbolic of? And there are many guesses around that. But what I'd like to focus on is the work of two scholars, both David Carr, whose picture you can see here, who's done more to explore the roots of the sources of Genesis than almost any other scholar, or certainly any scholar alive now, and has really changed how people see the traditional understanding of the three sources back from the 19th century Wellhausen documentary hypothesis to what, as Carr puts it, and many scholars put it now simply, P and non-P. Non-P generally refers to what I've been referring to otherwise as the Yahwist, but they use that to express the sense that they're not really sure where it comes from. I'm going to continue to use Yahwist, even though I don't understand it in the older way, going along with Carr and others, not from the Solomonic era, but as another exilic or perhaps post-exilic voice. That's not going to come up too much for our purpose today, though. For our purpose, what we're going to look at is what these numbers are symbolic of, and the general issue is their connection with the Babylonian exilic context. So you can see on the map on the right side various cities there in what's marked as the Old Babylonian Kingdom. And in the Sumerian king list, which we'll look at in a minute, we'll see how the names and years of reign of kings is associated with the monarchy being in different places. So the Sumerian king list, among other things, was intended to support the notion that all of these different cities participated in the sacred kingship that makes Babylon and its whole realm a holy city. But we need to look at some details about how numbers work in that. So let's start here. And this is the work taken from Umberto Cassuto, who I've looked at briefly before, the late Italian Jewish scholar who's done more to look carefully at these numbers than anybody else, and he's the basis by which other people can sometimes vary or debate. So he notes the undisputed fact that the Babylonians used a base 60 number system, and as I've noted before, that's why we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. In fact, why we've before the digital age thought of time in the circular sense of in a circle on a watch, with an hour hand or second minute hand going round and round the circle, a base 60 number circle there. So just as a watch divides the 60 minutes into 12 units in the sense of 5 minutes each, Cassuto notes that the base 60 number system uses the number 5 by making 5 years 60 months. And so we'll see how the ages of the patriarchs are generally multiples of 5 plus an additional 7. And that leads us to a couple of interesting calculations, as you can see on the right side of the screen. First, the total days from creation to the end of the flood, counting the 1,643 years times 365 days, equals almost exactly 600,000 days, or 60 times 10,000. Similarly, the total ages of the 10 founding fathers, using a U.S. American way of describing it here, is 8,219 years plus 7, which amounts to almost exactly 3 million days, or 60 times 50,000 days. Those certain things certainly can't be coincidences, and Kusuto uses those to show how each of the ages of these patriarchs is an expression of that, as we'll see in a minute. Also important, while I have this on the screen, is the relationship with the Sumerian king list, abbreviated SKL here. Older scholars, meaning from the middle of the 20th century, had seen the Sumerian king list as background for Genesis 5, then had rejected that, and now with Carr and others, it's made a comeback. And one of the aspects of that, as we'll see, is that both the 7th entry in Genesis 5 and the 7th entry in the Sumerian king list have something special about them. Enmed Duranki here in the Sumerian king list, and we'll see that it corresponds to Enoch in the biblical list, and you can see that down below. And there are other connections we can see there, in addition to the fact that Enmed Duranki is understood as having ascended to the sky to meet with the sun god Shamash, from whom he receives many secrets. That's not in the king list, that's in other documents about this Babylonian Sumerian hero. And in the Genesis story, we see that Enoch ascends to meet with God after living 365 years, or a perfect solar year of years. So many connections there, as we'll see. So let's look at the Sumerian king list for a moment, just to see how it's schematized. And at the start, we see these sections listing tremendous numbers of years of reigns. And notice in each one, it's described as the kingship taken from one city to another. And you can see those listed there, starting with Eridu that we looked at before, and some of these other cities along the way. And then after the flood, the kingship descends from heaven, and you see how the numbers get much shorter very quickly there. So they get shorter, down from tens of thousands of years to hundreds of years, very close to the Genesis range of years, but it continues to get smaller, as we see throughout this, reigning for very realistic years, and eventually, as we'll see down here, connects with the historical reality that we know from other sources of the Babylonian empires. First, the original old Babylonian kingdom, the map referred to here, with people like Sargon as kings, and you see the dates here noted of the BCE reigns of those kings, and then that continues down all the way up through to the end of that early Sumerian Babylonian kingship. It doesn't contend all the way to the exilic era, which would be a millennium after that, because it's a much older document than that. So what do we do with that? Well, as Kusuto shows, all these years correspond here. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'll put it on the web page so people can download this if you like, so you can study it in more detail yourself. But you can see how each of the named people in Genesis 5's age is divided here into their age at the time of birth and the age they lived after birth and their total lifespan. And all the numbers work out to some multiple of 60 plus 7 or something like that, as you can see all the way through here. So thank you to Kusuto for showing us all that. But we're not going to go through all the details here, but something important happens partway through, and as we were already referring to, that's the 7th one. So just as in the 7th, if I go back up here, you see in the 7th kingship here, you see it as Enmed Durana, another way of saying it. This is the 7th one here, and he ruled in Sippar, which is one of the cities we saw on the map. That corresponds here to Enoch. So we see the Enoch tradition, which we'll look at more after we look at chapter 6, verse 1 to 4, generated an entire literature of itself. One collection known as First Enoch, another collection known as Second Enoch. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll see how influential it is on the New Testament, which this series is not about, but it's connected with that in many ways. But to do that, we have to look both at what we see here in Genesis 5 and what we'll see in Genesis 6, 1 to 4 in a couple sessions going forward. So we see, after this long, repetitive pattern description, we see very different here. It starts in verse 21 similarly. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. But then it changes. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. So the phrase walked with God, you see it's twice in this little description here, in verse 22 and then again in verse 24. The phrase walked with God, as you can see in my note down below, is used also for Noah and also for Abraham. It expresses much like what the New Testament has of following Jesus in the act of discipleship. It's a little different than faith as something one holds within oneself. And the Hebrew Bible doesn't really talk about faith. Occasionally it does. We see the classic example in Genesis 15:6 that Paul uses and other people used in the time of the Reformation to talk about the question of Abraham having faith before the Torah. But that's a rare example, and of course that's why Paul and the Reformation scholars go to it, because it's a rare occasion in the Hebrew Bible where someone is spoken of that way. Much more common is the sense of walking with God. In other words, one's relationship with God is a part of, metaphorically, the journey, but also literally the life one makes. Not just something one holds within oneself in a static way, but the question of whether one is with God, as Enoch is, or turned away from God, as we saw that Cain was back in chapter 4. So he walks with God, and all his days are 365 years, which is interesting here because largely the Babylonian world operates on a lunar calendar, and the Hebrew Bible to this day is a lunar calendar. That connects with the Sabbath as a quarter of the cycle of the moon. But both in the Hebrew world and in the Babylonian world, obviously the sun was an important reality. We saw in Genesis 1 that the Hebrew Bible, here in Genesis in particular, makes the sun simply a daylight as opposed to moon being a nightlight and not a god. The god, though, had the same name, Shemesh, as the object does here in Genesis. So although Genesis takes it, the celestial entities out of the divine realm, there certainly is a sense of something special about the sun, which is obviously related to life and light, and also death in a culture where the heat can cause you to die of thirst in the absence of water. So he lives an entire solar year, and then something strange is he was no more because God took him. The root word there, ayin, for not there, is used for many nots, 37 times in Genesis, as you can see, but it's a strange thing to describe it for a person. Somehow he didn't die, but was just taken, as it says there in the rest of the verse. It's unlike the chariot we see Elijah going up in, the fiery chariot. It doesn't describe how it happened, but simply that God took him. And that, again, will connect with the idea that Enoch, from that position in relation with God, can see things and relate things to humans that were otherwise not available to God. So we will continue with this list next time, but I will note, as David Carr notes, and I'll just put this on the screen for a moment here, the parallels between the genealogy we saw in Genesis 4 and in Genesis 5. We'll look at that again next time because we're not going to finish this with Lamech and then Noah, as we'll look at next time. But something is going on there, and Carr makes the note of the distinction between linear genealogies, as we see here, which simply say father to son, father to son, father to son, and segmented genealogies, which include brothers and sisters and such, and we'll see that in chapter 11. So different kinds of genealogies for different purposes, to connect people with later people with their ancestors, and we see in the New Testament, of course, both Matthew and Luke do that by starting Jesus off with a genealogy, but also establishing relationships between the world of the past that's inaccessible to the audience of the text at issue and the events that they're experiencing. So here, this genealogy, again, is not an expression of how long people lived, but the symbolism that, unlike the Sumerian world, where the ancients were kings and then find themselves as the ancestors of the kings in literal cities of Babylon in the time of the audience, the ancestors in Genesis are simply human beings who live for these symbolic long periods of time. No different in character than ordinary human beings, except for Enoch. And again, we'll look at more about him in a couple of sessions. So that's a brief overview of these often skipped over genealogies, and we'll see more about the role they play as we continue through the primeval history. See you next.